I think we're both looking extremely nervous on screen.
Yeah.
So,
Oh, yeah, I was.
well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this podcast interview with one of our perhaps most distinguished alumni from Linacre in the last few years, Professor David Gavaghan. David is the Professor of Computational Biology in Computer Sciences and also the Director of the MPLS Doctoral Training Centre, which we will come back to, Dave, in a minute or two. But perhaps more importantly, you and I are direct contemporaries from our time at Linacre, matriculating in 1986.
Yeah, scary, isn't it?
It's extraordinary how we've both got here. And, well, at least I'm wearing a tie these days.
I've got a jacket on with all.
So, what are your memories of those first few days? What brought you to Linacre?
So I came here supposedly for a year to do a master's course as an undergraduate in Durham in mathematics. I hadn't quite had enough of the student life, so I thought I'd come to Oxford for a year. And I never quite escaped. So I got to Linacre and loved it and stayed. And I don't know if you remember, but my first dinner in college on the Sunday evening was with you. So I sat down and you sat down opposite me and we had a chat. We've known each other ever since. So, first few days. My overriding memory of the first few days is going into the college bar and meeting so many people from different countries, but also so many unusual people. I don't know if you remember them. We had some South African ANC activists in the college, right. And they were the first two people I met. And the guy behind the bar was from Canada. And they made me, everybody there made me feel so welcome. It was completely eye-opening to me. And I hadn't met people like this before. It was an amazing place. So.
And how did that compare with how you had perceived Oxford to be before you arrived here?
I think that's a good question. I think I probably thought it was going to be a lot like Durham. Durham is a lot like Oxford, and the first people I met at Durham were people from, very posh private schools, public schools, and then I met other people, more like with similar backgrounds to myself. Coming to Oxford and coming to Linacre in particular, it was very different. I mean, there were people from all sorts of backgrounds, all sorts of nationalities, all ages, and I certainly hadn't expected that. And of course, I didn't know Linacre existed. I ended up here because I got assigned this as a college. And I'd come down to visit and I'd been interviewed, but I hadn't met anybody. So I didn't really know what to expect. So it was very different, but it was very pleasantly different. It was a wonderful surprise.
So we chose you rather than choosing us.
That way around. I came for an interview and I was offered a place. It was actually on the day that Gary Lineker scored a hat-trick in the World Cup in 1986, I think. So it was auspicious. I thought that's got
auspicious. And football carried on playing a big part in your life even when you got here.
It did. Well, sports in general. I think I was I went along to the first Saturday morning. I went along to a football training session run by, you remember, Graham Fraser-Bell, who was the captain at the time. It turned out he was also captain of rowing. And so, I played football quite a bit, so I would run around and they could see I could run a little bit. So the first thing he said to me, Monday morning, 6 a.m, you're down at the river, you're going to be rowing. I said, I've never rowed, I don't row. But I turned up, tried it out and absolutely loved it. And I think that's one of the ways we met as well. We ended up rowing together.
Well, Graham Fraser-Bell was living in Brewer Street. So he was one of the people I met on my first day, and quickly established that I was a rower.
You'd already done it.
I had no choice from that point on. But many of your memories of Linacre must be of great football matches. I mean, the football team was tremendously successful.
It was at that time. We had some really good players. We were actually talking about this earlier. One of the big advantages we had is the chef at the time, Mike Bucket, was a very, very good goalkeeper. So nobody scored any goals past us. So we went a whole season, I think, conceding virtually no goals and winning every single game and winning the league fairly easily, making it to the cup final that year, I think, the Cuppers final, and got beaten on penalties.
In the final, I found the report of that.
So we missed a couple. I missed a penalty. I think it's the only time I ever took a penalty in a shootout, and I missed one.
Right.
I felt I had to because I was captain. I had to take one. But really fond memories of all of that.
And I was telling you that I found a letter in your student file this afternoon down in the archives from Brian Cartledge, wishing you luck for the upcoming match with Ruskin, which turned out to be quite a memorable one as well.
It certainly was. I think we did end up winning that game, but they certainly won in the number of injuries that they we Yeah, we didn't match them physically, let's put it that way.
No,
but we did.
They were
we did in the football.
team,
They were a pretty hard team in those days. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, on the academic side of things, you work in computational biology. Just tell me a little bit about, first of all, what you did for your DPhil, and then where research went from there.
Yeah, sure. So actually, it's quite an interesting story how I got into doing computational biology. So I was here doing a master's in numerical analysis and mathematical modeling. And then I took a year out, but continued to be associated with the college. That's the year I was actually captain of all sorts of things, working in the anaesthetics department in the Radcliffe Infirmary, and got really interested in biomedical research. Never thought I would be able to do that as a mathematician. And then at the end of that year, I was looking at different sorts of jobs, and I'd been offered a job at big management consultancy firm, paying a reasonable amount of money. So I asked my MSc supervisor if he would write me a reference. He said, "Oh, come and talk to me." And I went to talk to him. He said, "Wouldn't you rather do a PhD? I've got a case of wood, and so would you have a look at it?" But I said, "Well, actually, got interested in all this other stuff in the hospital." He said, "Well, we can probably combine the two." And so we talked about it, and it actually ended up with me being sponsored by the anaesthetics department to do my DPhil.
Yeah.
And what I actually worked on was the modelling of blood oxygen sensors, which are used in if you have bypass surgery, heart bypass. Your blood goes through an oxygenator, and you need to make sure that the oxygen levels in that blood are kept very constant, and those little oxygen sensors, and the optimal operation of those. So that was one of the things I did. But at the same time, I was working in the anaesthetics department, so I was kind of the resident statistician. So all the medics were coming in, and so a lot of the papers that, my well-known, highly cited papers from that time when I was doing medical stuff. So I did that in parallel with my DPhil, and I was here as well. So that took me into computational medicine, really. And then when I'd finished that, I actually applied for a Wellcome Trust fellowship. This area was growing quite rapidly, and I was lucky to be one of the first recipients of a Wellcome Trust Biomathematical Training Fellowship.
Yeah.
And that set me on the road to becoming an academic, I guess.
Yeah.
Not what I ever expected to do, I must admit.
No.
My career goal, if there was one, was probably to be a maths and PE teacher, and that's what I still expect to become one day. I don't think it's going to happen now.
Yeah. And I think you were a very interesting example of somebody whose academic prowess, academic abilities really took off through your career. Looking at the references that I can see from your school and from Durham, you weren't a stellar mathematician before you arrived, but during your MSc you really flourished, and then things took off during your PhD.
Yeah, I think so. I think I gradually got more confident. So I come from a background where you wouldn't go necessarily. I was the first in my family to go to university, so I didn't really understand the university process. And getting to Durham, I found it quite difficult to settle in. I gradually improved there. So, I did okay in the first year and quite well in the second year, very well in the third year. And then when I came here, when I was doing my master's degree, I did much better than I expected to, which is why I stayed on. And then, during my DPhil, I just got really interested. I got really, and the motivating factor was the applications of the mathematics, doing the medicine and the biology. I just found it fascinating. I still think it's the hardest subject. I'm not a biologist, so I can say this. It's incredibly difficult, it's incredibly complex, but there's so much that you can do. And that just became motivating. And then, there weren't many people doing mathematics in that area. So you could apply relatively straightforward mathematics and get a long way. And that was immediately rewarding. So I just kind of kept going, and then really got into it. And then there were opportunities to take on PhD students and so on. So as you say, you could start building a group and do really interesting things.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you say that the biology is the difficult bit and the maths is easy, because you and I had a joint PhD student, and I have to say I found the biology relatively straightforward and the maths impenetrable.
Yeah. Well, we had to learn the biology, and that was the challenge for us.
That was an interesting project. I really enjoyed doing that.
Yeah. Can you believe it's 20 years ago? I looked it up before I came.
Yeah. So this was a project that we did looking at explanations for high diversity in tropical rainforests, and I had data and theories about how this might work, and Dave and Philip Miney actually modelled them to see whether my ideas were correct or not. Well, I think it was Caroline,
it was our
PhD student, who did all of the work.
But it was a fun project. It was actually building on your DPhil, I think, wasn't it?
Yeah, very much so.
And I think you went back out and did some more field.
That's right, with Caroline. Yes, and some filming with Planet Earth at the same time.
Oh yeah.
So tell me that background, that your experiences of going to university first in your family, finding Durham quite a difficult place to get used to, but then gradually finding your feet, and then really flourishing at Oxford. that presumably has had a very big impact on your attitude, your ambitions for how you feel that universities ought to operate, and where you perceive to be the really important challenges.
Yeah, I think hugely. I mean, that's been a motivating factor throughout my career. As you know, you mentioned at the start, I set up the Doctoral Training Centre in MPLS in 2002. And that was to train students coming from backgrounds, primarily backgrounds like my own, physics, mathematics, STEM subjects, and wanting to move into biology and medicine and apply their methods there. And I wrote it with a guy called Peter Dolan, who was the prof in stats at the time. And what we wrote down was the training that we would have liked to have received at the start of our PhDs, which would have allowed us to progress really rapidly. But in running that, over the last 20 years, we've had, I think, 1,500 students enrolled now. It's a huge number. Gradually over time, it became clear that students from different backgrounds were progressing at different rates and finding it more or less difficult to settle into Oxford. And so that got me interested in the whole idea of how you train students, how do you create a positive research culture, collegial atmosphere, inclusive research culture, and how do you attract students from all backgrounds into that kind of environment, and provide the environment within which they can flourish. And so, that's been something that I've worked on for over 20 years now.
Yeah. So this idea of a doctoral training centre was one that you really cooked up and has spread quite widely throughout the higher education sector now.
I can't really take credit for the idea. The idea was somebody called Leslie Thompson at EPSRC, who was the research director there in 2001. Did a little tour because she wanted to set up something called the Life Science Interface Program, which was a funding program for exactly that. People from physical and mathematical sciences wanted to work at the interface with the life sciences. And she had this idea that it might be a good idea to provide training to PhD students through a cohort-based PhD program for them to move from one area into the other, rather than assuming that people can just pick up the biology and the medicine or pick up the technical skills. We would actually train them to do this. Now, she didn't have any specifics around that, and she didn't really call it cohort-based training, but we applied for one of those. I wrote the application, so I guess a lot of the ideas were mine. But we applied to that, and we got one of the first two in the UK. The other one was in Edinburgh. And we've actually managed to keep us going all the way through. And what we did introduce with this idea of cohort-based training were the students, whilst we would, give them lectures and so on, they would learn at least as much from each other as they would from us. And the strengths of somebody with a biological background compared to somebody with a mathematical background would become obvious in the different modules. So if we're doing a biology module, the biologists would still do it, but they'd be supporting the mathematicians, and vice versa. And so in an interdisciplinary environment, we know, because we've worked in this way, you've got to trust the other person. You've got to be absolutely confident that what they're telling you, it may not be, it may not be correct, but they believe it to be correct, because we never know with research. But you've got to be confident that there's a respect there, and you're actually working together in a collegial teamwork environment. And so we could create that artificially within the DTC, and all of the projects we set are of that nature. And it started to work, and it was quite clear that the students were really enjoying it. And so, we did have quite an influence eventually. So when EPSRC looked at this, they expanded out the two programs. It quite quickly became 15 with the Life Science Interface. And then in 2009, I think it was, they actually, just before that, that's when they rolled it out across their entire portfolio, this idea of CDTs. They brought counsel to our DTC to show them what it was like when they were trying to persuade them it was a good idea. And so then they rolled it out across the entire portfolio, and then it had greater influence more widely. And they asked me to go along and give a keynote when they rolled that out of the Royal Society. So I was quite involved in that process.
So for those of us who did our PhDs quite a long time before this, what would be the big differences that you would see now if you came to Linacre this year to do a doctorate? How would it be different from doing it in 1980?
So for some students, if they're not in a doctoral training program, then for some of them would be quite similar. Certainly even in the arts and humanities, there is a doctoral training centre. So some of them would go through that route, some would go through the traditional route. So if you're going through the traditional route, it would be quite similar, except there'd be a much greater emphasis on professional and career skills development. And in most disciplines, there would be a greater element on doing some talk courses in the first year. There's usually a requirement to do 2 or 3 talk courses at least. If you're in a centre for doctoral training, which is probably, top of my head, 40 or 50% of our students now, then you would see a huge difference, because there's in the standard model, you come in knowing what you're going to do for your DPhil, your PhD supervisor is. You probably wrote a research proposal, certainly in the social sciences and humanities. That is the thing you're going to work on. You go into a centre for doctoral training, none of that's true.
Yeah.
So you get admitted to the centre for doctoral training because we think you're going to make a good DPhil student. We think you've got the potential to do it, but you're not assigned a supervisor. We don't assume you know how to do anything really. So we provide 1 or 2 terms of training. Over the course of that period, you'll meet supervisors. And then typically you'll go on and do 2 research rotations, one of which will become your PhD project. So we both provide training and guidance in how to pick a project that is right for you, and then allow you to try it before you buy, if you like.
Yeah.
And the biggest difference, the thing that we got right, I want to pick on one thing that we got right on day one, is we gave the funding to the student.
Yeah.
And so the student has the funding, and then the supervisors effectively have to attract the students to them. So they put forward projects, the students discuss them with them, and they may take that project. They may take a slight variance on that project, but that drives up the standards across the board. Okay. The same people are teaching, so it drives up the standards of teaching, and then the students are much better looked after because then the supervisors know they're going to come into their group, and so they will talk to next year's students, and so there's a sort of virtuous circle going on there, and that's the big difference. Effectively, the power gets transferred to the students, and I think that's absolutely critical.
Yeah, and the other advantage, of course, is that actually this provides a much softer landing for students, perhaps who coming from non-traditional backgrounds, but who have huge potential.
Yeah, for sure. And we've been working on this for a few years now. We'll probably talk about it more broadly, but within that environment, in the last few years in particular, we've been able to focus on attracting students from those sorts of backgrounds with setting up scholarship schemes and so on. But then once they're here, what we can do is provide the on-course, on-program support. We know from research in the States that it's no good having diversity initiatives when you bring students into an environment with which they're not familiar or their families aren't familiar, and then just assume they're going to be able to swim, because on the whole they find it quite intimidating. So you actually have to create that environment, and within a doctoral training centre it's really easy because we can identify those individuals, and they can choose to engage in the activities or not. But we've set up with Linacre an Academic Futures programme where the students actually work together and support one another, and we have EDITs of various kinds to actually support them. We've got really strong welfare support, and working with the colleges, we can really support those students as they come in. And that kind of non-academic community building approach really does help. And that's one of the things we've really found. And I know you've found similar sorts of things at Linacre.
And your passion for this, has its roots also in your own family background. I'm sure you won't mind me saying that you came from relatively modest circumstances.
Yeah. I mean, I was the first from my family to go to university at all. I mean, a couple of my cousins went to FE colleges at the same time as me, and my aunt eventually went to university, but that was after me. But I was the first one to go to anything like Durham or Oxford, and so it was completely unfamiliar. In fact, I applied to Oxford I didn't get into Oxford. I applied to Oxford as an undergraduate and didn't get in, which was a good thing because I think I would have found it too intimidating. But I went to my careers teacher when I was applying and asked her where else did maths, and she said Durham, and I didn't know Durham had a university. So I was that again. So I'd only heard of it from a song. So I went up there. The first time I knew what it was, I had to find out where it was and go. So there was no tradition of that. Although there was really strong encouragement from my family to do academic things all the way through. They were incredibly supportive of this slightly strange chap who went off to a grammar school and then was good at mathematics and whatever. So so there was no tradition of that. And so when I did, as I said earlier, when I went to Durham, I did find it quite difficult at first until I found a group of friends from a similar sort of not even necessarily similar backgrounds, but who I could fit in, who played sports and so on. So that did inform what I was thinking. And because I'd been in a collegiate environment at Durham, and then I came to Linacre, which was so community-based, I'd found that an easy transition, actually, relatively speaking. So here I'd felt really comfortable, but it did motivate my thinking. And the other thing that really motivated me to get involved in graduate access was when they introduced the 9,000, when it went up from £3,000 a year, the undergraduate tuition fees, to £9,000 a year, which I think was in about 2012, 12 or 13 years ago. And I realised immediately that if I'd left Durham with £60,000 worth of debt, there's no way I'd be sitting here. I would have gone and got a well-paid job and I'd have paid it up, because that wasn't something you
Yeah.
wanted to get into. So
Yeah.
so that's when I really got interested and started actually trying to do something. It took another 5 or 6 years to get anywhere, but at least I started talking about it widely and trying to motivate colleagues to do things about it.
Well, let's focus on that a little bit more, because perhaps it would be useful to explain why it is that graduate access is such an issue, because I quite often hear amongst colleagues here that we've got huge initiatives here at the university for undergraduate access, and that should launch them on a journey. Why do we then need to have another boost at the graduate level?
Well, one reason is that if students coming out from undergraduate degrees with huge debts, they probably won't stay on into postgraduate study.
And is there evidence that that's the case?
There is, increasing evidence, and our data, because we've been collecting data with socioeconomic data for the last 5 years now, at a university level, is that the numbers from the lowest socioeconomic groups in the UK are not coming through into postgraduate education. It is, and certainly not into postgraduate research. They're not doing DPhils. So, and there's really strong evidence of that. And that, I think, is a mixture of no family tradition and large amounts of debt. Even if you get the maximum amount of local authority support as an undergraduate, you're still going to come out with huge amounts of debt. And so they go and get jobs. And then they're not coming back because they go and get well-paid jobs. And we know that, even anecdotally, from some of the summer schools that we run, students from disadvantaged backgrounds are coming on that summer school. And now there's a competition for those sorts of students. So they're going off to Goldman Sachs, they're going off to Microsoft, and those are real examples. So that's one of the issues. And so, but the other reason why graduate education is and because we're not getting those students coming through, the reason that it's so important to have people coming through from a graduate perspective, graduate and access perspective generally, is that we don't have anybody at academic level who looks like or sounds like the kinds of students we're trying to bring through from disadvantaged backgrounds. So if you come to Oxford for an interview, or a Russell Group University, or a leading research intensive university, and you don't see anybody who looks like you when you come here, either as an undergraduate or as a prospective graduate student, you are much less likely to apply. And of course, a prerequisite for becoming an academic pretty much is getting a PhD. So if we've got nobody coming through with getting PhDs, then we don't have that group of academics who can actually support people coming through, the people who look like them. And then it has knock-on effects into other areas, like in industry. So if you're in the pharmaceutical industry or in policy, quite often a DPhil is a prerequisite there. Publishing, most people have got PhDs. So those areas haven't got anybody who looks like them as well. So it's knock-on effects in wider society, but the gateway is actually getting the PhD. So if we can solve that problem, then we can start to have a much greater impact at undergraduate access and bring everybody through the pipeline.
And why does that matter, in a sense? I mean, Oxford is overwhelmed with incredibly smart people, even if they come from a relatively small sector of society. We have places on some of our graduate courses where we have over 1,000 applicants per place. Does it matter if any of them are not coming from disadvantaged backgrounds?
So there are at least 2 reasons why it matters. One of them is that we know from our data that our graduate applicants are pretty much like our undergraduate applicants, and they are overwhelmingly from very well-off backgrounds. So I think it is something like 70, nearly 80% of our graduate applicants have one parent, and most of them have 2 parents, in the highest possible professional category that we have. So most of them are from very advantaged backgrounds, which means we're only selecting from a small proportion of the world's population, because 64% of our graduates are from overseas. But they're from us. So there's this massive pool out there of incredibly bright people, and we are not tapping into all of it. So if we got the access, the graduate access part right, we would push up standards across the board of the graduate students that we're taking. Now, they may not be as obviously, good as they arrive, but their potential will be absolutely huge because they won't have had the advantages as undergraduates and at school. But if they come here and they've got the potential, then they will really thrive here. So that's one reason. And then the other reason is we have a fairly homogeneous population. They've got quite similar, they might come from different parts of the world, but they come from similar backgrounds. So they've been to the same sorts of universities and they've done the same sorts of things. If we can diversify that, then we get different perspectives on the research coming in. So if we took more mature students, for example, then we get different perspectives. If we take students from different socioeconomic backgrounds, then we get different perspectives. And that will change the nature of the research we do in, I think, very positive, in my experience, very positive ways. Whenever I take on a mature student, they come with a completely different perspective, and they bring completely new ideas into the project, which are very positive. So there's two huge reasons why we want to be able to.
Yes, the old aphorism, great minds think alike, is unfortunately very true in research. And that's one of the things we don't
want. Exactly.
Okay. Now, tell me a little bit about some of the big barriers to making a difference here in Oxford.
So in terms of graduate access, the biggest barrier is just getting students from non-traditional backgrounds, shall we say, to see Oxford as being for them. And that is the biggest one. We just do not get students applying to us. So if you look at the lowest socioeconomic, well, below median earnings, okay, students applying to Oxford from below median earnings, which presumably is half of the population, we get about 11% of our applications from the bottom half. So they just do not apply. And when we talk to them, well, as you know, we set up a summer school called Unique Plus, where students can come here for 6 weeks and experience a research internship.
These are undergraduates.
These are undergraduates, and they can come here and see what it's like to do research at Oxford.
So they're embedded in a laboratory or in a research group.
And they're embedded in the college, and Linacre takes several students every year, as you know. And they come here and they find out what it's like, and they meet us, and they realise that we don't have two heads. You know, they realise that we're just people like them, and what we're looking for is people who can do research with us. And they have a great time, and a large proportion of them apply. And because they've been here and they've got some experience, their success rates last year, this is hot off the presses, were the same as our standard applicants. You know, our standard, and that's absolutely amazing, because it's gone from 10% to 40%. So when we do put something in place, we can support those students, and that is the kind of thing we need to overcome that barrier of getting people to see it for them. And the knock-on effect it has is that you've probably seen some of these. Those students come along and they're very media savvy, social media savvy, and they'll make blogs and they'll put things on the internet and they'll post about it and they'll post in the student room and so on. And then that creates a groundswell of students from those sorts of backgrounds thinking about this. And so that program, we have about 140 places a year, gets 800 to 1,000 applications every year. And so it's one of our most sought after postgraduate courses, but it's a 6-week internship. So that's one, and there are many other barriers, but the most important barrier is that one. And then beyond that, as you know, the biggest barrier is just scholarship funding.
So probe that one a little bit more, because I think it's really useful for our colleagues to understand.
This is really important. So with the best will in the world, students from disadvantaged backgrounds do not look on CVs like our traditional students. So our traditional students go to university, and they go to research intensive universities across the globe. Sorry, my foot's gone. And as a result, they all look very similar on paper. So if they're a scientist over the summer, they'll have done internships. If they're humanities, they will have done research projects with leading academics. So they look very homogeneous. Our students from disadvantaged backgrounds will be working, if they're from the UK, will be working in Tesco's over the summer, so they can pay the tuition fees next year, pay for their living allowances next year. So they just don't look the same. And so they cannot really, on paper, compete for our Clarendon scholarships or our major scholarships, because the best of them can, because they come top in their degrees. But the ones who are good enough to come here and have the potential to do really well do not look good enough on paper. So the first thing we need to do, once we've got them to apply, is to have, for a while, have ring-fenced scholarship funding that only students from those backgrounds can apply for. And that's what we've been working on over the last 5 years. And as you know, because we've worked on this together, we've now reached a stage for next year where we're going to be able to fund, I still haven't quite got over this from the meeting the other day, we're going to be able to fund 100 students next year from those backgrounds. Now, our goal when we started this 5 years ago, I should say to everybody, Nick and I have been doing this together. So I'll ask you a little bit about that in a moment, if that's all right. Our long-term goal was to have as many scholarships for access candidates as we have for our excellence candidates, if you like. So that's our Clarendon scholarships, which everybody knows about, which we have 200 and something. It fluctuates a little bit, but it's just over 200. So within 5 years, we got to half of that, which I think is quite remarkable. And I think within another 5 years, I think we'll actually get there. So I think those are the two most important things, because obviously if you come from a disadvantaged background, you don't have 120,000, 130,000 pounds to pay for a PhD.
Yeah, yeah. Now I'm asking you questions that I'd like to answer.
Yeah.
Is there any indication that these scholarships will become siloed as scholarships for poor people?
No, I don't think so. Partly because of what we call them. We call them academic future scholarships. I was, as you know, I was all for calling them Clarendon scholarships from the outset.
Yeah.
But what they get in their letter is just Oxford University scholarship, just as everybody else does.
Yeah.
It doesn't say Black Academic Futures, doesn't say Refugee Academic Futures. So on their CV, they can say that this is just a default scholarship. But actually, they're incredibly competitive. It turns out once you have that ring-fence funding, you get, so the number of applicants from, say, Black British students since we introduced our Black Academic Future Scholarship Scheme has gone up. I can't remember the exact numbers, but I think it's tripled.
Yeah.
And the proportion of students at the university is who from that background has more than doubled in the last 5 years.
Yeah.
And so they get more and more competitive. And also when the students are here, they thrive, they do really well. And so that, I think that goes away quite quickly, that perception.
So these are prestigious scholarships.
These are prestigious scholarships and they're very competitive.
Yeah. Okay.
Even within that ring fence.
Now we call all of these initiatives access, and that's a term I have a little bit of a beef with, because it's not just about getting them here, it's actually about supporting them. And perhaps it's even more about supporting them when they get here. So the Academic Futures programme does that for some of these students, doesn't it? Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so again, the research in the US showed that on-course support was at least as important as actually providing the support to get here in the first place. So we started working on that straight away. And the way we did it in the first year, we thought of things that we thought might be good. So we did academic things and we did some social things. But of course, once we had a first cohort of students, we could talk to them about what
made a difference to them.
So we asked them to be student ambassadors, and they designed the program of on-course support for the following year. And one of the things they told us straight away is we don't need academic activities. We've got those in colleges and we've got them in our departments. What we need is community building activities. And so we need, social events and dinners and just things that allow us to get together. So we allowed them to put that together, and that's been fantastically successful. And as you know, the feedback from the students themselves, somebody talked about it in a meeting the other day, is that community is one of the things they find most supportive. So they're coming to Oxford and they are seeing people who look and sound like them, who will support them in their journey through their defaults. And I think that has meant that we've had pretty much no dropouts on those scholarship schemes. I think if we hadn't done that, we may well have done.
Yeah, it was interesting that at the start of our conversation, we were talking about the things that made Linacre a special place for you, and it wasn't about the seminars.
No.
Oxford was a wonderful place to be a research student, but the thing that you remember and you talk about is the football team and being in the bar and the people that you met there. And it's, I think, really instructive, actually, that social dimension, that community of scholarship, in a sense, is so important in ensuring success, isn't it?
And it's true in the DTC too. That's what we tried to do there. We tried to make the DTC, I mean, it's only during the daytime, we go to the colleges in the evening, but during the daytime, we're trying to make it a community feel where everybody's trying to support one another. And on day one in the talk I give to the students when they arrive, is I always say to them, over the next year, we're going to try to teach you not to compete anymore. You've been in an environment where you've tried to come top for your entire life. That's been the point. You can't come top in science. It doesn't make, you might win a Nobel Prize, but not many of those around. You've just got to learn how to actually work together as a team. And so the entire thing is geared around that. And I think that's what colleges try and do as well. They try and create this community atmosphere where it's what you said, we're a community of scholars who are all trying to move, knowledge forward. And it sounds hyperlogism, but that's what we're trying to do. And it's a great environment within which to do that. It's incredibly supportive, especially if you're coming from that sort of background.
Yeah, they're really interesting. There's some research that I cited from the US in the latest alumni newsletter demonstrating that having strong friendships with people who will support you is so much more important than having people who will support you who have subject specialism. So if you're struggling on your maths MSc, it's better to go and talk to somebody who's doing an environmental change MSc if they're a good friend. Than it is to go and talk to another mathematician.
Well, that actually happened to me at the end of my DPhil. I was really struggling to write out. And I was in the bar here, and my friends just said, "What's wrong? What's wrong?" And I said, "Can't do this anymore." And I'm supposed to be going to Boston to a conference to visit another friend from here. You remember Bob, June? And I said, "I'm not going to go. There's no way I'm going to finish my DPhil if I do that." And I was meant to go for 2 weeks, go for a week for the conference, then go and spend a week with Bob. And they said, "You go." And if they hadn't said that, I don't know whether I would have got through. But they made me go. And I went over there and I had a rest, went to this great conference, spent a week with Bob, had a really nice time, and came back and finished it off, no problem.
Yeah.
All the problems that I was, having writer's block, all that stuff had gone away. And it wasn't a mathematician, it was just my mates in college who told me to do that.
Yeah. Now, you're part of the project management group for the Close the Gap project, which is a really interesting piece of research on this. Tell us a little bit about that.
So that one is a joint project with Cambridge, funded by the Office for Students. Each university actually got substantial funding, £800,000 over 4 years. And what we found when the reason we teamed up with Cambridge is we were talking to them about what we might do, but we're also both looking at our admissions data. And what we found was because we'd only just started collecting it, there was a huge gap in offer rates to students, basically from white British students to Black British students and Bangladeshi and Pakistani British students.
Okay, give us a feel for the difference, because it's quite shocking.
It is entirely shocking. So for white British students, it was 40%. For Black British students, Bangladeshi British students, it was 20%. So you were twice as likely to be offered a place. Now, there may be lots of structural reasons for that. There are some structural reasons in that students from some culture, some ethnic backgrounds don't apply for some subjects. So they apply for very competitive subjects like law and medicine and things that go into professions. So that maybe could explain some of it, but certainly not all of it.
Yeah.
And so the Close the Gap project is a research project to try and understand what it is about our admissions process, the whole thing, including subject biases, that leads to that gap, that awarding gap. And of course, we're doing all the other things in parallel, so it's difficult to say. We've interfered with the experiment. So one of the things we're doing is changing the admissions process in collaboration with eight departments in Oxford, 8 departments in Cambridge, and monitoring what happens there, and just looking at whether there are any inherent biases. And there are technical things, what we've discovered is it's very heterogeneous across the university. But also in parallel, we've been running other schemes like the Academic Future Scheme. So for Black British students, that gap has come down to about 8 points this year.
Right.
For Bangladeshi and Pakistani students, where we don't have a specialised scheme, it hasn't closed as much.
Cool. Yeah.
So it's closed a little bit, but not as much. So there are multiple things happening at the same time. So we're actually introducing, as you know, a scheme for Pakistani and Bangladeshi British students the year after next for precisely this reason. So it's a really interesting project, and it's really interesting that both Oxford and Cambridge have the same issue. Other research-intensive universities probably have the same issue,
but they don't have the data.
They don't have the data yet. They've only just started collecting it. So we're a few years ahead in terms of data collection.
Okay. And one of the big steps forward that we've made is to collect socioeconomic data now on all of our applicants.
So we've been doing that. I think this is the 6th cycle. And it's voluntary, but we get 95% compliance. So we really know what the background of our applicants is. We know there are some areas that it's going to be very difficult to shift the dial. The most difficult one is socioeconomic disadvantage. We haven't really made any impact at all there yet, in spite of 5 years of trying. So that'll be the focus going forward.
Now, one thing I've got to ask you about is the little bit of fun that you and I had last term with with the applications process. You're getting a bit of a reputation as a troublemaker here in the university. Tell me a little bit about that, because this was to do with the application fee that we charged.
So I should say, I'm going to touch camera again. This was a joint effort between me and Nick. The first person I asked when I was trying to do something about this was I went to Nick to talk to him about it. So there was a motion in 2020, I think, that went through congregation right at the start of the pandemic to remove the graduate application fee. So the university charges, or did charge last year, £75 to apply for a graduate degree, whether that's a postgraduate taught degree, a master's degree, or a research degree at default. So now on the face of it, that's a barrier to access. It seems pretty obvious that if you're applying, and it's £75, if you're coming from, a low income country, or you're coming from a socioeconomic disadvantaged background in the UK, 75 quid is a lot of money. But when they were doing that, I said, we are going to introduce fee waivers for all of those groups. And over the subsequent 5 years, we did introduce fee waivers for all of those groups. So if you had a low income in the UK, you didn't pay it. If you're in the bottom, I think it's 40 countries on the OECD list in terms of GDP per capita, then you didn't pay. But that wasn't good enough. They were still going to go away because it got passed through congregation. Over that period, the number of applicants to the university more than doubled. So it went from below 20,000 to over 40,000 last year. And all of our colleges became utterly swamped. And when they introduced, they did away with the application fee for DPhil students in Cambridge, and that increased the number of applicants that year by 42%.
Yeah.
So we were going to go from something like 40,000 to 60,000.
Yeah. We were facing a tsunami of new
Absolutely,
applications.
tsunami of applications. And what that would have done in many departments, not in all departments, is swamped all of the graduate access initiatives, because everybody would be so busy processing that they couldn't do. It takes longer to take a contextual approach to assessing an application to see whether you need to take into account the background in assessing that application. You wouldn't have time to do that.
No.
And everybody was absolutely terrified of this. And every committee that we went to, people were saying, what on earth are we going to do next year? And we got further and further into the year. And I think just after Easter, I was sitting in Education Committee, and everybody was saying this is going to be an absolute disaster.
Yeah.
And I just thought, we've got to take this back. There's no way
we need to do something.
So I thought, well, I've got all the data. I'm probably the only one who's got all the data because we've collected for the last 5 years. So I better do something. So I wrote a paper, as you know, and put all the data in, made the arguments, explained as clearly as I possibly could, and then sent it to you. And then we had a chat about what we should do, and we decided the only way we could do this is to take it to congregation. Now,
which is sort of the nuclear option.
It is the nuclear option. So we actually, and then we didn't do that first, did we? We took it to the university hierarchy, and they said, the only way you can do this is take it to congregation. And I suppose I can say this, and you won't win. That's what they said. And we said, well,
and if you lose, it'll never
come back. It'll never change. It'll never come back. No. And so I think they were thinking it could be chaos for a year. We can judge this between us, and then they were going to bring it back because there's been chaos. And we said, you can't have chaos for a year. Yeah. That's not. So we took it. So anyway, we decided, I think, after a little bit of consultation and with some of the colleagues, a lot of colleagues' help, that we would just take it back to congregation, which is, as you say, a nuclear option, because you have to take it to the university's highest body, and the contortions you have to go through just to get it there, as we now know, the scars on our back. Which involved at one point, as you know, me cycling around Oxford trying to get signatures over a weekend so that we could actually put it on a piece of paper. So we could actually put it in time. But we did it, and it went through. So.
Yes, it went to a postal vote in the end.
Went to a postal vote. So I think the thing, we haven't said this, the thing that swung it, I think, is the thing that we decided to do, which we would say we will keep it and we will use all of the proceeds for graduate access.
Yeah.
So to set up scholarships for students who wouldn't otherwise be able to come, and we will extend our waiver scheme. So once we'd done that, I think we got people on board. But when it went to a vote, the opposition was still quite strong, and we won by, I think, 2 votes, was it?
Yeah, it was quite
very close.
Yeah.
But then we did a compromise with the opposition, and it went through quite easily. Yeah. But as a result of that, this year we will have an extra just over £2 million for scholarship.
Yeah.
So that's a lot.
Yeah, which will make a big
huge difference. Yeah, well, that takes us from whatever we had last year, 40 odd to 100.
Yeah.
So huge difference.
Yeah. Now, many of the initiatives that you're talking about are going to make a tremendous difference here within the UK. What about access internationally, which is a much more difficult issue to grapple with?
So the only one that we've had enough funding to grapple with and enough information to grapple with is refugee and displaced people. So we've set up a refugee academic scholarship, academic future scholarship scheme a few years ago. That got a boost with the Ukraine scholarship scheme, which was funded separately, but was taken into that. And then next year, because we've got the graduate application fee, we'll be able to expand that out we'll have 10 scholarships just in that area next year. And that will allow us to take more and more students from those sorts of backgrounds. Obviously, at the moment, there are more and more refugees looking to come to the university to study. For other kinds of scholarship, we need to have a means of assessing what socioeconomic disadvantage actually means internationally. And you know from your work with the Commonwealth Scholarship Commission and with the Roads Trust, that's a really difficult thing to do. So at the moment we have a research project which is funded as part of another scholarship scheme called the Optiva, by the Optiva Foundation, which is actually looking, it's a 3-year project which is looking how we do that. So we actually got in touch with lots of US universities, Australian universities, to see if anybody knew how to do it. And it turns out nobody knows how to do it. So we're actually trying to figure out what it means. We do have socioeconomic data from international students, and we are using that in some pilot schemes. We've got one in the DTC to actually provide the funding to allow students to get here. So it's no good giving a student a scholarship but not providing the visa costs and the flights and the NHS surcharges, because that's about £6,000.
Yeah.
So we do that based on the socioeconomic data, but it's not as good as, it's not been validated in the way the UK one has.
Yeah.
So a big piece of work is that over the next few years, and then we'll be starting to reach out. There are some other initiatives through, as you know, through AFOX, where we've already got funding for master's students, and we'll build on those. So we've got we're learning across the piece really.
Yeah.
But it will take us maybe another 5 years to start making any inroads into international students, I think, because it's just such a difficult.
Yeah.
And how we will do it then, because we will get applicants from everywhere. There are a lot of people in the world.
Yeah, a lot of people would love to come to Oxford.
Yeah, I would love to come to Oxford. So it's going to be a nice problem.
Well, the other challenge is the financial challenge for the university, isn't it? Because actually we're very dependent on our overseas international student income in order to keep particularly your division afloat.
Indeed. So we'll have to strike a balance as we go along, because it is a bit odd, and we don't tend to do this, to charge ourselves large overseas fees for scholarships that we give to overseas students. I'm sure that financial people would rather we did it that way, but it's probably not the best way to go. So what we do is do fully funded scholarship packages with the on-course support as part of the scholarship. And this is the university's, graduate access is the university's, from a development point of view, the university's #1 priority at the moment. So, so the student team and the development office, this is #1. So, and they're just starting. We had some news last week. We had a reasonably large donation last week. We're just starting to gain traction, because obviously undergraduate access outreach has been a big thing for a long time. And so donors come in expecting it to be there. When you say graduate, why do we need to worry about graduate?
Do we have graduate?
Yeah, exactly. What is that? Even though we're now a majority graduate university. So that's going to take us time to actually get donors to see why it's important. And now having a large group, we've got a couple of hundred students coming through our different schemes now. Having them, we can now make, they're really very helpful in making, case studies, video diaries, and so on. So we can actually make promotional materials to raise this money. So I think we're at a tipping point. I think we're just at the point where it's going to start to take off. I hope, and then we can do international things. Okay,
Dave. So if you were, becoming the principal of Linacre from tomorrow, what would be your focus? What do you think this college should be doing in order to have real impact and real value to the university as a graduate community?
This is going to sound like I'm trying to butt you up here, Nick, but you're doing a lot of good things, so I'm not sure I'd change.
I was hoping you would.
I'm not going to
leave in question.
So I can say this because it's true. The go-to college for us in the DTC, if we have a student who we think might need strong support, or we have students coming in late, or we have students from disadvantaged backgrounds in Linacre. And the graduate colleges in general, but particularly Linacre, because you have such strong emphasis on welfare and community building. You're very open because you allow people to come here and dine, so they can bring their friends along. You open up to AFOX and the Oxford Africa Initiative. You have fellows coming from all of these schemes. So what you've been doing so far is actually a model for the way the university as a whole could do it. If every college was behaving like Linacre is, we would not have a problem with, many of the problems we have. We wouldn't have. I think I would keep going in the same direction. I think Linacre has an opportunity to carry on leading in that direction and carry on building up the emphasis on diversifying the graduate in whatever way. It doesn't have to be socioeconomic disadvantage. It can just be mature students or whatever. But Linacre is very open to that and always has been. And I think I would really, I'd kind of double down on that, if you like. I think, and I would, as you do, I would carry on advocating in the university as strongly as I could that that's the way to go. And I think, certainly in my division, my head of division would be happy to say this. Linacre is seen as doing that, and that's the reputation it has. And so if I took over as principal, and if I could maintain that reputation and even enhance it in some way, then I think I was doing a pretty good job.
Okay. And on the development front, scholarships or on-course support? This is the big challenge that I grapple with, is do we want more, but perhaps not very well funded, or do we want to really have a deluxe scholarship scheme for the students we've got here?
I think if it was, because it's more difficult for Linacre to raise funding because of the alumni situation, I think, so you're going to be raising relatively small amounts compared to the older colleges. I think having that Rolls Royce of on-course support would probably be the way to go. But I would also, because I've got the links now, and you have, and I know you're doing this, I would be working really hard with the development office to say, if you get people coming through the door, we'll give them dinners. We'll look after them. We will talk to them really nicely.
Yeah.
The other thing I just to come into my head, maybe partnering with other colleges, that might be something to do with one of the older colleges, just sort of, they're getting all these people coming in. I don't know how you would do that, but you could maybe try and do something like that where you're influencing them with the on-course support and they can maybe support with the development efforts. I don't know what it would be. I think one of the things we miss generally across Oxford is we don't work collectively enough. There's a competition a lot of the time.
Yeah, particularly in development.
Yeah, exactly. And I think with graduate access, we have an opportunity to move away from that a little bit and do it in a much more collegial way, because nobody's really thinking about it. So if we could get that off the ground from day one, I think that would make a big difference.
Yeah. I have to say, I think the university has moved a long way.
Yeah.
When I started as principal, there really was almost outright warfare between the colleges and the university, and that's changed dramatically. And we work very, very closely with the centre now, and actually very effectively. I think we're both better at it as a consequence, because we know our donors and they've got much greater capacity than we have. So, great. David, it's been fascinating talking to you. I'm dragging you off to a Burns Night supper this evening in college. So it's the first Burns Night supper in Linacre for a very long time, but we've got a piper and some whiskey and I hope some vegetarian.
We have someone with the students. That's good. That's great.
Great. Okay, well, I hope you have enjoyed listening to Dave. I certainly have, and we look forward to continuing these conversations, I think, in a week's time. Is that right? In a couple of weeks' time, when we have another distinguished alumnus of the college coming to talk about their career and their experiences at Oxford. Dave, thank you very, very much for coming to join us this evening. It's always a pleasure.
Thanks.
Okay. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.